You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Leanne Brooke-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. We don't right now have any offerings in terms of you being able to join us on the path of Awaken the Wild. They will be coming soon, I promise you. For now, I really suggest you come join our free Facebook group if you're not already a member. It is a gorgeous group of wild, wonderful, and wise people. So come join us if you're not already there. And that's at facebook.com/group/primalhappiness. Really hope to see you there soon. And now onto this week's show. It's with Aidan Wachter. Aidan has been involved in practical magic since the 1980s. He's an animist and is deeply concerned with the effects of the modern Western lifeways on the human animal on both physical and spiritual levels. Aidan views a living magical practice as a path to heal many of the problems we face today and a way of being that's intrinsic to the creatures we are. He is the author of 6 Ways, Approaches and Entries to Practical Magic and Weaving Fate, Hypersigils, Changing the Past and Telling True Lies. In this show, we explored the intersection of rewilding and magic, or how they're actually 2 sides of the same coin, or one stone, as Aidan says. Given the power of both rewilding and magic, bringing the understanding of them together in this way is such an important and helpful conversation for anyone who wants to reclaim their full power. I absolutely loved it. I adore Aidan and all of his work. Honestly, I am delighted to be able to share him with you and this conversation with you. I really hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Let's dive in. Hello, Aidan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you for having me.
Oh, honestly, my pleasure. My pleasure. I already know that before we even started recording. This was one of those topics that I'm so overexcited about. I realized we were already having the conversation that I want to have now before we'd hit record. I was like, whoa, we have to stop. I'm going to ask you everything, which is usually a really good sign. Yeah. So, oh my goodness. This is one of those shows that I feel is much more than just a kind of, I don't know, interesting, helpful, engaging episode, which obviously that's what I always hope to do. I really do feel that this is, as we were saying earlier, like something the world needs to know. Right now, this is so important. And so my hope is in this time, we're just going to illuminate something that I've been kind of piecing together gradually, and then through your work kind of just suddenly saw this so much more clearly. So I feel kind of almost a bit emotional about this. Like this feels so important to be having this conversation. So let's dive in and see where it takes us. But I would love to know these two, we're talking about almost like 2 sides of the same coin is really how I'm seeing it now. On one side, we've got rewilding. On the other side, we've got magic. And I certainly had a moment, particularly when I came across your work, I'm like, oh gosh, yes, these two things aren't normally together, or have I missed that they're together? I don't think I've missed that they're together. Wow, this is incredible. So I would love to know, like, how did you arrive at that point of seeing, these two things belong together?
That's it's a little bit difficult to try and hit the point where I did. And so for folks that don't know, my background is very eclectic within the magical world. I didn't come in on a main line through paganism or ceremonial magic, though I have backgrounds in both of those. And I think what happened was, as I got closer around folks who were practicing what I considered real magic, that they were actually trying to affect change through magic, and they weren't, it wasn't devotional work, which I saw a lot in the pagan community that I was around. There was a lot of other stuff going on, but that's the piece of it that I had exposure to. But anyway, so as I started watching that, I began trying to piece together my previous life experiences in a way that would mesh with this kind of stories, mostly coming out of ceremonial magicians and a few what we would now think of as traditional witches. And the traditional witches were completely fine with it. They didn't necessarily have anything that they could help me with. But if I could kind of explain what was going on, they would be able to go like, yeah, you're having spirit contacts that are a little out of control, or things like that. And the ceremonial.
What kind of things might they be, if you don't mind sharing?
I had a couple of visions, waking visions, in my 20s, where I literally saw kind of other worlds open up in front of me for a moment. It was the first idea that I realized that there were like places that were kind of intersections between our normal, what we think of as the normal real world, and what I now think of as the other world. And then a bunch of dream experiences that had kind of impacts into my daily life, in that they were kind of unforgettable. So I've talked about one of those pretty extensively, so I won't really go into it here. But when I was 11, I had an experience that is traditional kind of European folkloric thing, though I had no exposure to that stuff, of meeting the man in black. And that was the point where my life shifted. And I didn't tend to get the results people were getting from their magical work. So doing ceremonial magic rituals or whatever, what tended to happen was that I would then get kind of a spirit contact outside of that. What I now think is like my allies didn't really care for that structure, but they could tell I was looking for something. And so they came along. They went like, okay, he's knocking on a door and it's not my door, so I'm not going to go through there.
Oh, I love that.
But, but I might pick up the phone and give him a call, right? Is one way I would think of it. And so I began moving further and further outside of kind of traditional magic and looking at other sources, which were more kind of what was available on kind of shamanic practice, things like that. And then for me, I don't do well with like music or drumming kind of trance induction, which is kind of traditional in most shamanic practices. So I never went there. It doesn't really work for me. But I did really well with kind of the trance inductions that are kind of based on Ericksonian hypnosis. And so I really worked a lot with that. But I was still kind of at a crossroads of sorts. Like, I couldn't find the form of magic that really looked like what it, or felt like what it was for me, until I came across a guy named Jan Fries, who's a German magician. And Fries was really this like wide open, like, I don't know what I'm talking about necessarily, and you shouldn't necessarily think that I do, but these are things that I have found helpful, and you could try them. These are exercises you could just explore and see if you get something from them. And he's also very much a get outdoors guy. You know, I just started rereading the second book of his that I'd read, which is his book on runes, Hellrunar. And he says, I'm going to expect you to go outside and get dirty and play around outside. And so if you don't want to do that, you should give this book to someone that will.
Oh,
like he was really upfront.
Yeah.
Like, this is not for you. I'm not interested in the academics of here, even though he's very academically sound. And so he kind of, coming across that, gave me permission to go, okay, I have these natural inclinations about how you do stuff. And when push comes to shove and I really need to try and influence something, this is where I go anyway. But there was some part of me trying to fit myself into the models of Western occultism. And so that's kind of the path that started this all. And it heavily intensified, even though I'd had a lot of kind of intense experiences hiking in the mountains and things like that. When I moved fully off grid, no solar or anything like that, no running water, onto 50 acres in the middle of thousands and thousands of empty acres of rural Tennessee. And my wife and I lived there for a year and a half without any stuff. And I think that's really when I kind of hit this intersection where I'd come across concepts of rewilding from kind of anarcho-primitivism and those who are questioning modern civilization. But I had not really dove into it. But the term made sense to me based on what I was experiencing. Like I found like, I can work so much better out here without having to worry about all of the static is my experience of the world that we've kind of created. Is it's incredibly full of static as it relates to us trying to practice magic. And so I think those things just kind of naturally began coming together at that point. And the more I kind of played within that, the more I realized that I'm totally with you. I believe that magic and rewilding are, to me, the term that I use in my most recent book is they're one stone. They're not even two sides of the same coin necessarily, but there's a distinction that makes it really hard to get there. And why I think what you said, is this even out there? I don't know if anybody else is talking about this stuff the way that I am. Because it is very different from Western occultism. That's a totally different thing. And it's not that there are huge levels of intersection, but I think that's why it's hard to find. It's what we're really mostly looking at is either work coming out of folklorists, folkloric rooted magical practices, or we're looking at kind of things that come out of a very, to me, modern view of the spirit world.
Yeah. Oh wow, what a lovely story. This is a slight segue, but something I'm really hearing in what you've just shared is, I may have this wrong. I'd like to see what your sense of this is, but it felt like, despite the fact the practices you were trying weren't necessarily having the results that you wanted, it felt there was a kind of deeper knowing that this was your path, which I really envy, because as I shared with you before we started recording, I've just had this kind of complete love-hate relationship with the magical path where, I've spent more time. I'm just not going there. Nope. And I really envy what you've talked about, that it's like for you, it was like, it seemed like a certainty, like, no, this is my path. I just haven't quite found like my place on it, or my way, or how I walk this that's unique to me. But it feels like there was the deep knowing that kind of kept you walking on it. So I'd love to hear, was that your sense of it, or was it not as clear as that?
No, it really was. I think by the time I was 14, it was really solid. Like there's something, and this again, it ties into to our dual themes. I really didn't understand the world I was raised in. I didn't understand why it was attractive to my parents. The world, if it was, I don't think it probably really was, but it's what they knew how to do. And they both kind of explained later that to them, there was no choice. This is just what you did, right? But even as a young person, I was like, I don't want what they want, and I don't want the things that are kind of presented to me as the things you should want. And I didn't know initially what that meant to me. But as I kind of became exposed to what I'm going to say is kind of older ways of perception, it became really clear. Like, okay, I'm not seeing the form of this that is me, but this is the closest. And
yes.
so I kept looking.
Yeah, this is closer. I love how in Weaving Fate you talk about these tracks that we get stuck on. And it feels to me that you could see the magical traditions that you're exploring were off the tracks of that kind of, mainstream culture, but still weren't quite your path. It was kind of, I'm at least in this kind of nice, wild grounds, but I haven't quite found my place in it yet.
Right. Yeah. And that was very much my experience. So, I was fairly public in the 80s and 90s as a magician. So I was involved in a lot of more or less public ritual work, and then smaller private groups and things like that. And I always remained kind of with this sense that unless it was something specifically that I had created that I was leading people through, it was all a little off. There was something very interesting, and I really chose to try and learn from that. Okay, this isn't really my voice that I'm seeing. It's a tangent to that. It's not unrelated. It's very related, but I really kind of knew I had to kind of find the stream that was the one that I wanted to stand in, which eventually meant that I had to create it.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm so glad you did. So, where do I want to take this next? It's again, there's just so much here. I'm just trying to not get kind of overexcited. Like, let's go through it at once. Where I'm feeling called to at the moment, it feels as though both of us have seen maybe I'm paraphrasing incorrectly what you've said, but I think there's some truth here. The closest thing that I felt magically is shamanism. So currently, I've just committed to train as a shamanic practitioner, but I still have this sense like I won't regret doing that. That feels to me the closest to my path, and yet it's not wholly my path. It feels as though that's the closest, because that's so, so we see that where if we look across history, across the world, in Indigenous cultures, they'll have a shaman-like person. And so to me, that's another example of like when we live in wild ways, that comes with the territory. So it feels to me like a very, like as an archetype, a very, it calls to me as a very kind of like, that's the closest I can find. And yet it still feels like, and maybe this is because we aren't living in those ways. Like we have to always create our own version that fits in the modern world to an extent and takes in that kind of this stone you talked about that has this kind of magical rewilding blend. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. It seems like you had a similar experience with shamanism where it's kind of like, this is the closest, and yet it's still not completely where I'm meant to be heading. So I'd love to hear your sense of that.
Right. I very much had that experience. So it didn't have the effect that I realized that it had on me. I only realized the effect it had on me later was my dad had the first few Castaneda books. This was in the the 70s that I would have read those, towards the end of the 70s. And I was fascinated by the worldview, right? And we now know that these are not true tales, but I still think that they have some benefit and some very interesting perspectives that are useful. And I think that was kind of sitting in the back of my mind. Like that world made sense to me. Again, not speaking to me exactly, but like I could understand how you could be in that world. And that perception of the world would feel to me better than the one that I was growing up in the suburbs. And then as I was kind of playing with bits of magic that work, from ceremonial magic and chaos magic and witchcraft, I also began reading on traditional cultures. And I had the thing that I didn't want to dive in. And this is I'm going to say things periodically that will sound like I'm against different traditions, and I'm not. It's just realizing that they're not correct for me.
Totally.
So, like, I came across Michael Harner's core shamanism work, things like that. And it just seemed, again, it's like, there's stuff here that's useful, but it's not the same thing. And I think what finally happened was I began a process of really trying to, and I still do this, so I've been doing this forever, like, vision into, this is daydreaming, and then into trance work, but into what my existence might have looked like 100,000 years ago. And what would my experience of the world be? And this is it's a thought exercise, but it's also a dreaming exercise, whether it's daydream or actual dreaming or trance. And all of these happen to me now. And I began to see that if we look at that kind of shamanic worldview, and we look at kind of what I think of as the less urbanized forms of folk magic, witchcraft, we begin to see that there's a coherent worldview sitting behind all of those things, which is where I kind of come with the animist approach, right? And again, it depends on how you think about time, right? And I think about time in this really vast way. I go, okay, I accept that the Neanderthals were us, right? I accept that the Cro-Magnons were us. All of these bipedal versions that some people say, well, you don't become really human until 100,000 years ago or whatever. I don't buy that. I think that, no, we're essentially the same being.
Kind of the same, almost like spark of consciousness, just embodying.
It's happening, yeah. And the body's changing, the brain is changing, the neurology is changing.
I love that.
And so if we're looking at a field of magical practice then that is perhaps a million years old, this makes the questions of what's happened recently, which is, say, since recorded history of any form, not so important to me. You go, no, what does this embodied spirit, human, animal being, how do we naturally interface with the world we're in? And to me, that's magic. And magic seems very other or supernatural to us now because of the time and place we live in. But I think this was really just what we've always been in. And I think it's really probably the thing that has made us human, which is why I think I say in Weaving Fate, that might be in 6 ways, that I believe that magic is the kind of root of all human culture. It's the thing that's actually the defining thing. It's the root of all religion. Religion, I believe, came after. But this kind of takes, and this is just a brief thing, is realizing that magic is both a worldview and a practice.
Yes, I love that. I love that. What you've called to mind is where some of the books I love the most are really beautiful, almost like take you as deeply into that world as is possible when that's not the world you've inhabited and it's someone kind of writing about them. And one of the books is Original Wisdom. The other one is, I think, The Way of the Human. One's about a Indigenous band in Malaysia, and the other one's about Native American different worldviews, really. And what you're describing is so beautifully evoked in both of them, where there isn't this kind of, I don't know, humans going about their business, and then over here there's magic, or there's magical practices, or there's this magic exists here but doesn't exist. Like the entire way of being is infused with this sense of deep connection to the point where connection, funny enough, I said this only earlier this week about something completely different. When the experience, I start to always just get like a tingle of, like, it's just like slightest sense of is way beyond connection. It's just like, it's all the same thing. But being able to live as kind of separate human beings, yes, and just immersed in this magical, interconnected experience is the sense I get from any time I'm sort of dropped into this like just way of being that, again, is so alien to us in this modern culture, but it totally is what you're describing, which is, again, hard with our modern domesticated minds to, like, it does take, it's like a real, envisioning, dreaming, like, we have to be in that state to even start to get a sense of it. We can't intellectually make sense of this. But I love what you've said there. Really, really does match the kind of, when I get a glimpse of it, it matches what you've said.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting. It brought to mind a thing that happened when I was living in Tennessee. And we had a particular kind of deer netting up around a garden. And it became, it was a terrible trap for the snakes because I think that they didn't really feel it. So they would weave themselves into it. And then you get stuck. And so I would go out and, cut them free and release them because I quite like snakes. But I went out one day and we lived right near a creek and there was a water moccasin caught in there. And it was a really interesting thing retrospectively because I could see the way it had caught itself. One of the lines of the fencing had pulled back its gums. So you could see this is a venomous snake. This has got big ass teeth that are not for holding prey. And I didn't even think about it. It's like I sat down and talked to it for a while and told it what I was going to do. And then, got control of its head and cut it free. And it took a long time because I was being really careful. It's like, and also I wanted to be as relaxed with it. And it stayed pretty relaxed through the whole thing. And then when it was done, I took it across the street and kind of fed it into a rodent hole in the ground so it couldn't turn around if it had right in. And that experience was exactly that thing that you're talking about. Like there was this whole, other than the consciousness that this was a venomous snake, which I would have had at any time if I had experience with snakes, there was no part of kind of my civilized mind being concerned about what I was doing, about whether this was a good idea. And instead, there was this really strong just connection to this being. And it has that feeling that you're talking about more than anything. It was just that feeling. And that is, I think, the thing that I started hunting as I got an inkling of what magic was to me. It was like, what feels right?
Oh, yes.
I don't care at all about whether anyone else thinks it's right. Just what is the piece that feels the most right, and kind of learning to follow that chain and going, okay, so I do this now. You can't see it, but I have, a pile of kind of the talismans that I break out when I talk to people like this. And, different ones kind of come to hand depending on who I'm talking to. And it's all based on that. There's no, it's not a rational decision in any conscious way, but it's that ability to kind of choose path based on actually kind of just knowing, like, that is correct.
Yeah.
In this case. And our systems don't really like that. They like, it is always then correct in this case, right? This is how we like to break things down. If it's correct now, well, then it must always be. And I don't find that to be true at all.
Yeah, that's back on the tracks, isn't it? Back on the tracks of civilization. Something that I was just pondering was how can I say this? So I'm going to create a separation, which is actually not necessarily true. but just for the being able to talk about this, I'm going to act like they're two separate things. If you can bear this. So with, I guess you could say types of work, change work type thing, like coaching, where you're one way or another, or whether you're just doing this as like a sort of personal growth exercise, where you're setting a vision and intention and sort of creating life from that place. It seemed to me, in being in that line of work, there was such a need for rewilding, because otherwise, how are you going to be able to create from that deeper place, that kind of like soul felt place where what you're creating is actually in alignment with who you came here to be versus what our culture is telling you should want. And so that was really, I don't think we necessarily planned it out this way, but Jonathan and my business partner and I, we really could see like this is essential. If you're giving people this kind of powerful technology, being able to like create their lives first, or at least somewhere along the process, they also need to have this kind of their mind rewilded so they're able to actually create what's in alignment for them at that deepest level. And then the more I started to understand about magic, first of all, I realized like, that whole kind of life creation is really just kind of like somewhere on the same spectrum of magic. They're not two different things, but hey. But there was then the more I saw that the magical community weren't really understanding the benefits of rewilding, I was like, the same problem exists over there. You've got all these magicians with this like powerful technology to like create results, create their lives. But aren't they going to be doing it from that same domestication as the people over there? And I don't think I've got a really great question here, but I just really want to understand like what your sense of this is. Having you are obviously far more aware of the kind of the community of magicians. Isn't that a known issue? Like how are you going to know what to create? I mean, this goes back to the whole true will conversation, but how would you know that without having done some form of rewilding?
I think that this is a great question, and I think it's I don't think it is generally addressed. Usually what you get is people suggesting like, how do I know what it is that I want? And people will often suggest, well, you can journal about it, you can divine for it. But again, you're not dealing with that root perceptual kind of issue, which is what I perceive it as. And so it's very funny because people will come to me because of the books and go, this is my problem. I don't know where to begin. And it's almost always the same things that I tell them. It's like, there's not a fix until you can kind of know what it is that is really correct. For you.
Yes.
In most cases. There are some things that, you're under attack. That's a different thing, But so to me, it's a very strange aspect of, again, it's why I make a distinction between occultism and magic, which a lot of people don't like as something that we'll talk about. Because occultism is really the study of hidden things, the study of magical things, by definition, right? And if we accept that that's true, then we have this thing where we're trying to amass enough information to come up with the right way. And this is the issue that I have with it, is like, no, there is no one right way. There may have been a time where within a particular tribe, there was something like that. Because that was what the culture supported. And that's what supported the culture.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
But we are way beyond that point now. And so to me, it's like, how do you learn enough tools to kind of come into enough of your own power that you can begin to strip away all of that stuff that really isn't you and try and get to your intrinsic self? And one of the really odd things that I found is that getting people to really begin doing practical magic for things, is a great way to unveil that stuff. Because you go, I worked really hard and I manifested this thing and it's not right. It's not satisfying.
Yeah.
You go, okay, so what does that tell you? If you ask those questions, what does that show you? It's another thing I'm kind of always on about with people about magic is like, okay, you did that thing and you didn't like it, how it worked out. What does that mean? Both about what you were asking for, your thought processes behind it, the fact that you were able to do it even though it wasn't great for you. What is this showing you? Right. And to me, usually it's showing that we have to find a way to kind of get in touch with that very deep aspect of ourselves. What I think Jan Fries talks about, and I really like, is what he refers to as the deep mind, which is not, it's the higher self, the true will, the animal body, all of those things together form the deep mind, is how I understand him. And so to me, that's really the goal. There's lots of other stuff you can do along the way because there's no reason to not use it to improve your situation. That's what people have always done. But to me, the rewilding aspect is like, do you want to be carrying all of these dreams, visions, ideas, fears that aren't native to you? You got them because of who you were born to, where you were born, what was going on in the world. But they're not really you.
Yeah. I love what you said actually about the if we were living in an indigenous life way, you're right that the context would be there in terms of we would have had visions and a kind of sense of why we're here that's like contextual. It's like baked into our way of life.
It is
we would
contextual.
have had and we could look kind of 7 generations back, 7-8 generations forward. We would know what's needed. It would have been handed down to us. It's baked into where we live. It makes sense. And you're right, most of us have nothing remotely like that as a way of kind of knowing that what's for us is what's for us, or we think what's for us was for us. Like, that's so true. And it seems to me that rewilding to any extent is never going to give us that. We can't sadly just reclaim an entire life way around us, but at least takes us like some way in the direction of that.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of critical point, that you can go, or I do this where I go, okay, I believe that what we have is a civilization problem, which comes about due to population increases, and then has a negative feedback loop. And this is just talking about for kind of individual psychic health. This is not, there are folks out there that are saying like, we need to wipe out everybody so that we're back to that world. And I'm not one of those people. But, we know that things were fairly stable until kind of really the development of agriculture, which allowed the development of the city state, which allowed civilization, right? And what happens is we've kind of removed, it's almost like it's an additive issue, right? You do that process and you're then able to create kind of a medical class that goes, okay, we could work out how not as many women die in childbirth. On the surface, this is a brilliant thing.
Yes, yeah.
Right? Absolutely. There's no downside that could have been seen at any point, right? Each of these things make sense on an individual level. On a planetary level, it becomes very sketchy. Okay, at what point, how many billions of people is the carrying capacity of this place with the way that we want to live? And with the oddity that if we wanted to live in a different way, it wouldn't be an issue because our mortality rates would be much higher. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's a really weird set of kind of things that I think are what jam people up around these concepts sometimes, is they feel like they have to get on a track and go, okay, I'm anti-civ activist.
Yes. Yeah.
We all need to go so that the planet can heal. And I totally feel that in my heart as something that I can feel the sense of that. And I can feel the kind of love for place of that. But all of these different streams, whatever they are kind of, they're tracks. And to me, the key for the individual is really going, do you want to be on a track, and what is that? And if you don't. You don't have to. it will and every choice that we make gives freedoms and gives constraints. So you don't get to do that and to get all of the benefits of being on the track.
Yes.
So how do you weight your choices, right? And to me, all of these things are kind of root magical questions, but they're not ones that I see asked a lot.
Yeah. I just realized something in what you've just said. And this, I think, is, I think I said this before we started recording. It suddenly hit me that this, and I described it as an intersection. And again, the intersection itself is illusionary. If we see that magic and rewilding are actually as one, the intersection is really us just seeing they're coming together, if that makes sense. They were together. It's just the seeing of them that becomes the intersection. But in that intersection, it feels to me there's this just incredible power, real, like just multiplies when we bring those two, that understanding those two things together. And what I just saw in what you just said was that there is this just gorgeous wisdom that we really need right now in the understanding of how we've ended up in the place we are in this kind of civilized world, with all those kind of, as you say, this kind of way we address the problem without ever looking at the first principle, without ever looking at the root, and we keep building and building and building upon that. So rewilding is a gorgeous way of starting to look at kind of, oh, okay, we ended up here because we went, off in this direction. What if we kind of returned, here or here? Where magic comes in is it suddenly makes other things possible. And understanding that perhaps we do have access to wisdom that isn't of the intellect, isn't of this kind of logical, well, if that's wrong, we'll do this to fix it. But it provides, as far as I see, answers that we never otherwise would have come up with. It allows us to access states of consciousness, other ways of seeing the world, depending on your view, help from allies that otherwise we wouldn't have had help from. And for me, that brings real hope. Yes, we probably, I don't see a way of kind of returning to an Indigenous life way without kind of, creating massive wreckage. But what if we could create something that actually worked really beautifully, that was bringing both together, where we could see there's like real deep wisdom in those ancient ways of living, and the way that we're going to create that to work in today's world, there's an answer here in this magical way of understanding things, of seeing things. And I don't think I saw that clearly until what you've just said. So I would love to see what you think of that. But for me, that's why this is such an important conversation. Like, this allows something to happen that couldn't happen another way.
And I totally agree. And I do have I'm officially a little bit of a doomer in that I don't see, I see trajectories is how I think of things. And the trajectory we are on, I don't see really good at medium and short-term outcomes of as a kind of species. And to me, one of the things
I have to lend you my rose-tinted glasses.
Yeah, I just don't have it. Mine broke a long time ago. But it's also, in an interesting way, I was very much born this way, I think. This is a particular vision I've had my whole life. I never had a vision other than that, which is weird to say, but I remember being very young, 7, 8, and having this consciousness of like, this won't work in the long run. What we're doing won't work. But I do think that magic is kind of this crucial piece because it gives us the ability to interface with what I call the field, with the whole thing, whether you view it as allies or parts of self, and the world we're in, and ask very different questions, which allow us to produce and kind of go hunting for different outcomes. And it gives us a technology, for lack of a better word, to go do those things. And I think that there is an inherent benefit for more individuals being connected in that way. And this doesn't mean like everybody is like some ascended master or some of that BS. it just means that the more kind of connected folks, the more kind of connected choices are happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that even if you do have a perspective like mine, which is not super positive in the short and medium term, having more people that have access to this and who are raising children with access to this, these concepts and these tools, then means that it remains available further down the line. Because one of the ways that I see civilization in the last, particularly 500 years, has been to really try and shutter all of these kind of spirit experiences that don't fit into the kind of standard molds. And I think keeping those active, even if it's your or I's personal version of that, and then feeding that out into the world is innately beneficial. And that's the big thing that my allies have told me, is they were really clear when I remember I was making talismanic jewelry at the time. I was pretty new at it. And I asked them in trance, I was like, what is the benefit? You're all over this project. So what is the benefit to you? And they basically said that the transmission of what I was transmitting that way made it easier for them to interface with the world and with the people that were coming in contact with it. And as I switched more to writing, that was the same message that I got.
Oh,
was like,
I love that.
This is beneficial to us. It's beneficial to you to get it out there and to you to be able to have some connections with people you wouldn't have otherwise. But it's beneficial to us that you are helping people or providing people with an alternative path in. And perhaps view of them, I would say, probably is what I would add on my own. And I think that that's the difference that a lot of people hit when they come across the stuff that I'm talking about. Because what I mostly get from people that write me is, I've been trying to fit myself into these other magic, pagan, spirit molds that don't fit. And I've never been able to do it. And now I have someone providing me permission to just go, that's perfectly fine. It doesn't have to all be the same. It doesn't. You don't have to get on that track. You don't have to get in that box. You can figure out what it actually makes sense for you and your people, your allies, and do that.
I love that. I got when you're talking about what your allies said, I got what I often call now the truth chills. You know, you kind of get that like, oh, and I kind of like, oh, I know something's true when I get that. I had this delightful feeling where we often see, or I see it this way anyway, that we have these kind of portals into the other world, into different states of consciousness that can come in many forms, you know, trance and all the rest of it. And when you were talking, I was like, oh my goodness, what you're describing is the same as true the other way. They want portals to be more in this world, which I loved. I've never even thought of it that way before.
I think that's a constant message I've got. When was I living in the house where that came through? Early 90s, I think, is the first time I got that message from anything that I was working with. Is they were like, you all are gates for us back into the world, and it's hugely beneficial, kind of symbiotic relationship. Which is also where I have a lot of issues with a lot of kind of magical practices that are very coercive of the spirits. I'm not a fan because I'm interested.
Yes, I know. I hear some of the kind of binding and this, and I'm like, I wouldn't want to treat anyone like that.
No, absolutely. And that's always my take. It's like, how would you like to be on the other side of this transaction?
Yeah.
You know, because you can have it be transactional. That's not the issue. But and that's, again, I don't remember which book I talked about that in, that there really was this division at some point was created. Like, okay, it's either the legit spirits that we approve of, or you can boss them around or cast them out because they're just all bad news.
Yeah.
Gives me the heebie-jeebies, that concept.
Yeah, definitely. We are coming up on time, and oh my goodness, I have about 1 billion more things I wanted to ask you. I don't even know what to choose as a final thing to ask Oh my goodness. I guess maybe just a practical question. If someone's, as I shared with you earlier, the kind of segue more into conversations of magic have been a fairly recent thing for the show. And so, many of our listeners, this might be only the kind of first, second, maybe even third podcast on this show that they've heard where we're kind of really specifically talking about magic. And so, certainly if I'd heard a conversation like this a few years back, I'd have been like, what the hell? Really? What would you suggest if someone's kind of is sort of having a sense of, but this does feel like it's for me. There feels like, this is a path with heart. What would you suggest would be a kind of next step they could take, that next kind of breadcrumb of the soul for them?
There's two. The first is a very simple offering practice to your allies, because in my experience, everyone has them, whether they know them or not. And also just because it's depending on who you're talking to, they get different information from their allies. So I will throw out there, I don't know my allies' names. And I've had them for as long as I can remember. And that's very simple, which is simply putting out cool water, perhaps a candle, perhaps incense if you're not sensitive to it, kind of on the regular, and just being really clear that, if I were to do this, I have to kind of do these things, otherwise it doesn't work. Of just going, I'm offering cool water and sweet smoke and fire to my allies, those who aid and guard me and watch over me all of my days. Thank you. Do that every day for, the rest of your life, and see what happens. And then the second piece for those who want to go a little bit further is one that I created for that purpose. And it's on my website. And so maybe we could link to that, but it's also in my first book, 6 Ways, is a little ritual called the Reclaiming Rite. And this is just, it's a clearing out of some of the gunk and a recalling of the power that we've kind of lost or given away, and then a self-blessing. And it takes, once you've done it a few times, it takes 5 minutes. It's not a big thing. And again, I would suggest doing it every day, and see how that feels. I think that we are all connected. And again, I think magic is as much a worldview as it is a practice. And some people are called to practice more than others. And that's totally normal. And so don't worry about that piece of it, is what I would say. Kind of go with what makes sense. Don't feel like you have to go hunting all of the data about all of the stuff. It's like most things that matter, practice is really important, which is kind of just repetition of action. And this is funny because I pulled something up, and I'm going to pull it up now because it just occurred, and this is where this makes sense. There's a guy, I don't know if you're aware of him, named Ido Portal.
Oh, yes. Movement guy. Yeah.
Movement guy. And he says one of my favorite things that is, I think, really directly related to spiritual practice, though it doesn't appear to have one as far as I can tell. And he said in an interview, he said, and he's talking about information, but he's really talking about information when it gets in the way of practice. And he says, information is toxic and it is addictive, and we run for it. We have this thirst for information, but at a certain point, it turns on you and it paralyzes you and it freezes you up, and it doesn't allow you to apply and learn. And it's not anymore a contributing factor for your development. This lives on my desktop on a little file because I refer to it a lot.
I could do that tattooed on my arm, actually.
Absolutely. I'm with you. We can have our best friend tattoos of that one. And I think that's the other thing I would say is realize that the occult world is a huge wormhole of data and information, and only some of it is going to be useful to any one person. And so for people that are new, I always tell them, you don't have to go down that rabbit hole to practice magic. You can find one or two things that resonate with you and see what you can do with them. Because that's the biggest thing I think we kind of, as a people right now, it's our biggest error that I see. And I am fully guilty, which is we need to do something slightly different than what we've been doing. So we try and find the right way to do that rather than using the tools we already have to address it. Okay, well, how would I just shift what I'm doing already to get that? Do I really need a different love spell? Or can I just ask my allies for that and see what they suggest?
Oh my goodness. I'm so glad we've finished at this point. What's come to mind? And I'd be interested to know if you agree with this. It occurred to me recently that the way I hold magic is it's actually a birthright. If we go again back to what we were talking about, Indigenous lifeways, that was common to everyone. Yes, there may have been someone that kind of held the role of like magical practitioner, for example, but it wasn't like they were the only person. This was, again, as we're talking about, a worldview, a way of living, an experience of the world. And this is what you've just said, I think speaks that so beautifully. Like, you don't have to be all the way in. I think there's some of us that, for whatever reason, are called to kind of like really embark on the magical path. And not everyone has to, but it doesn't mean that magic isn't for them. Because if we see it as like, this is a birthright, this is actually for all of us, just having those beautiful ways that you've suggested where you can just step into a slightly different way of experiencing and being in the world, that could be enough. You don't have to be someone who's kind of like, it isn't a kind of like nothing, or you have to know everything about ceremonial magic. Like what you've just said, I think is such a beautiful place to finish this, because I think it is that. I don't think it has to be quite so all or nothing, know all the things. It can just be a shift in perception, and that on its own, I think, is so powerful. And going back to what we were saying earlier, what the world needs right now.
Absolutely. And I've been talking a lot on podcasts about music, but it's very much that thing. It's like, if your love is blues music, you don't have to learn classical music to play blues. Right. And I feel that this is the same thing, that, and the information age is beautiful and poisonous. And that's the biggest thing that I have is, if you know you get sucked down rabbit holes, just pick someone. It doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be you. Pick someone whose work resonates as a starting place, and then experiment, because that's the only way you're going to learn. All of this stuff is purely experiential. There's no amount of information that connects you to the thing that you're looking for.
Yeah. Oh, this has been such a pleasure. It really has, Aidan. If listeners would like to find out more about you and your work, and I can highly recommend your books, where can they go and find out all of that gorgeous stuff?
Everything is linked out of my website. So just aidanwachter.com. I'm growing less and less active on social media, but there is also a Facebook group for folks working with my stuff that can be found if you just search 6 Ways for Aidan Wachter on Facebook. It's there. And then my books are available through all the online retailers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been, I had high expectations, but it's actually gone beyond them. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Leanne.
Oh, really, my pleasure. Oh, wow. What a show. What a show. Definitely one of my favorites. Here are my top takeaways. Indigenous, in other words, wild cultures across the world and throughout history evolved with magic being part of the worldview and way of relating to themselves and everything around them. Aidan actually says that he sees magic as the defining root of human culture. Typically, modern magic hasn't included an understanding of the importance of rewilding. Therefore, unless someone has already been on the rewilding path, any magical practice will be happening kind of over the top of domesticated ways of thinking and being. If we were raised in wild ways, we would have been guided to live in a way that was in alignment with our deepest self, which we could describe as the soul or true will. But those of us who are raised in this modern culture will need to rewild, consciously choose to rewild, to release the dreams, visions, ideas, and fears that aren't native to us. Lastly, for those of us who are already on the rewilding path, the understanding and practice of magic provides us with the power to create positive change in the world that is in alignment with our deepest self. If you'd like to get notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, and I really, really would recommend checking out Aidan's work, specifically his books, do hop on over to the show notes, and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 312. If you don't want to miss out on next week's episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or your Android or iOS app of choice and hit subscribe. That way you'll get each episode straight to your device as if by magic. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.